The anatomy of cruelty. Why fascism stands as history's most destructive system. To understand why fascism represents perhaps the most morally bankrupt and murderous ideology ever implemented at scale, we have to look not at its slogans but at its logic, and then at what that logic produced when given the machinery of a modern state. The core rot. Identity as destiny, dissent as treason. Fascism's foundational premise is that the nation, or race, or Volk, is an organic, indivisible whole, and that the individual exists only to serve it. This isn't patriotism. Patriotism asks, how can I help my country be better? Fascism declares, the nation is already perfect in its essence, and anyone who questions it is a disease to be excised. That single move, converting disagreement into treason and difference into degeneracy, is what makes fascism uniquely dangerous. It doesn't just tolerate authoritarianism, it requires the elimination of the other to maintain the myth of purity. Every fascist regime, without exception, built its power on identifying a scapegoat population and systematically stripping them of humanity. The Holocaust, industrialized annihilation. The clearest instance of fascism's logical endpoint is the Nazi genocide of European Jews, the Holocaust. Between 1941 and 1945, the German state, using the full apparatus of modern bureaucracy, transportation, and industry, murdered approximately 6 million Jews in ghettos, shooting squads, and extermination camps such as Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, and Sobibor. But the Holocaust was not only Jews. The Nazi regime also systematically killed Roma and Sinti, approximately 250,000–500,000, the Porojmos. Disabled people, approximately 270,000, murdered under the T4 inches euthanasia program. Polish and Soviet civilians and prisoners of war, millions. Political dissidents, homosexuals, and Jehovah's Witnesses. The Holocaust was distinctive not merely in its scale but in its character, the deliberate, calculated, bureaucratically efficient transformation of human beings into undesirable material, to be processed and destroyed. This is what happens when a state decides certain lives have no right to exist. The War of Extermination in the East. Nazi fascism also prosecuted a war of annihilation against the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, 1941, that deliberately targeted civilians through starvation policy and mass execution. An estimated 20 to 27 million Soviets died. The Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units, shot over 1 million Jews and others in mass graves across Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltics. This was genocide conducted in the open, by ordinary men who had been convinced that their victims were subhuman. Imperial Japan, fascism's Pacific mirror. Fascism was not confined to Europe. Imperial Japan's militarist ultranationalism shared its contempt for human life and its worship of the state. The results. The Nanjing Massacre, 1937, Japanese forces killed an estimated 200,000–300,000 Chinese civilians and prisoners in weeks of rape, torture, and mass execution. Unit 731. A biological and chemical warfare research unit that conducted vivisection and lethal experiments on thousands of live prisoners, Chinese, Koreans, and others, without anesthesia. Comfort women. The systematic military sexual slavery of an estimated 200,000 women, mostly Korean, Chinese, and Filipino. Mussolini's Italy and Franco's Spain. Italian fascism under Mussolini, 1922–1943, pioneered the model, the squadristi violence, the dismantling of democracy, the invasion of Ethiopia, 1935–1937, where chemical weapons were deployed against civilians, and racial laws mirroring Nazi Germany's. Franco's Spain, 1939–1975, used famine, executions, and forced labor to purge the Republican population, with an estimated 100,000–200,000 killed in the post-war repression. Why, worst possible, is not hyperbole. Other systems have killed, but fascism earns the label, worst possible, for a specific reason: it fuses totalitarianism with a positive celebration of cruelty. Communism's crimes, the Holodomor, the Great Purge, the Cultural Revolution, stemmed from a perverted utopianism, The victims were meant to serve a future heaven on earth. Fascism had no such pretense. Its end was the domination, degradation, and destruction of the inferior, for its own sake. Cruelty was not a bug, it was the feature that bonded the in-group. Fascism also destroyed the very things that make collective human life tolerable. Truth, propaganda as reality. Memory, rewriting history. Art and inquiry controlled or banned. The family and community, subordinated to the party. Conscience, rebranded as weakness. The lesson that refuses to stay learned. The crimes of fascism are not ancient history locked in textbooks. They are a warning encoded in the bones of the 20th century, that a civilized, educated, industrial society can, within a few years, decide that murder is policy and hatred is virtue, if enough people agree that their own glory requires another's erasure. The worst thing about fascism is not that it produced monsters. It's that it showed how ordinary the road to monsters is, once a society accepts that some people do not deserve to live. Thank you for listening. It's time to build a better world, a world based in truth and harmony, a world that flows from within you for the best of all. Peace and blessings.